A young mother and her son flee a dangerous road, crossing forests and meadows to find a hidden village where no one asks questions, and safety finally feels real. Their journey is filled with suspense, hope, and resilience. Where are you watching this video from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm curious to see how far this story is reaching. You were never meant to know what happened in Harmonia Springs. Not then, not now. Even the men who dug the graves didn't speak of them, and those who did, didn't live long. The official story, filed in the archives of Lancaster County in the autumn of 1871, is nothing but a sanitized ledger of property seizure. 23 houses abandoned, 1 medical facility sealed, no surviving residents, end of record. But the truth didn't end there. When county officials forced open the heavy oak doors of the settlement's clinic, they found rooms in perfect order, as if the doctors had only stepped out for lunch. The beds were neatly made, surgical instruments gleamed under the grey light of a Pennsylvania morning. Bottles of pale liquid sat in rows, corked and labelled in a handwriting that belonged to no living man. And then there were the files. 14 wooden drawers, each packed tight with parchment-bound journals. 15 years of meticulous notes on human bodies, not patients, subjects. Every line a calculation, every chart a quiet betrayal of the human soul, and among them 1 small book, leather, worn smooth with handling. The ink inside faded, but the last page was clear enough to chill the blood. We were brother and sister. 5 words that would haunt the few who read them for decades. You see, what happened between 1856 and 1871 in Harmonia Springs was not just cruelty, it was design. It was a method so cold, so deliberate, that 3 separate congressional inquiries didn't just fail to punish it, they buried it, declared that the knowledge itself was a threat to public morality. And maybe they were right, because if you see what I'm about to show you, if you understand it, you won't ever see the human race the same way again. The nightmare began, as most do, in daylight, with a promise. Pennsylvania was bleeding. The Industrial Revolution had. It remade the landscape into something cold and mechanical. Men died choking in the black dust of Schuylkill County mines, their bodies discarded like tools that had worn out. Factory workers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh coughed themselves into early graves, their lungs filling with cotton fiber and coal soot. Children carried deformities from birth to death without ever hearing the word cure. It was into this quiet desperation that Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt arrived, 6 feet tall, prematurely white hair, eyes like polished slate. He spoke of Vienna, of Berlin, of medical miracles the Pennsylvania farm folk couldn't even imagine. He carried the air of a man who had seen the inner circles of the world and had come bearing a gift. 800 acres along the Conoy Creek, farmland, forest, and a natural spring whose water smelled faintly of sulfur. Here, Engelhardt promised, the suffering would end. Here, hereditary diseases would be cleansed. Children would be healed before their afflictions could even take root. He built houses in perfect geometric alignment, 36 of them, and a 3-story clinic with a copper-domed cupola that shone like a beacon over the valley. The first families arrived in March of 1857. They were chosen carefully, or so they believed, from among hundreds who had answered newspaper ads offering revolutionary medical treatment at no cost. Most came with children visibly marked by disease, rickets, cleft palates, twisted spines, seizures. They brought hope with them, and signed it away with their silence. For a while the miracles seemed real. Legs straightened, fits ceased, faces once pale with illness flushed with color. They began to believe that maybe this strange, brilliant man really had found the secret to life itself. But Engelhardt's rules were absolute. No one left without his permission. No letters came or went without his inspection. Every Tuesday, the community gathered in the hall, where he lectured on hereditary optimization, bloodline purification. He mapped their bodies, their temperaments, their bloodlines, as if they were not families, but breeding stock. And then came the first wedding. Sarah Graber, William Brennan. They stood under garlands of chrysanthemums, smiling like 2 souls blessed by God, never knowing they had the same father. That was where the experiment began. That was where the sickness truly took root. And what grew from it? would make even the strongest man turn away. They thought the wedding was about love. It wasn't. In Harmonia Springs, nothing happened without Englehart's design. The courtship between Sarah Graeber and William Brennan hadn't been chance. It was engineered. Days, hours, moments arranged like pieces on a board, each designed to push them closer until their hearts moved where their minds never would. Sarah had been in Harmonia Springs nearly 2 years by then. The seizures that once dropped her without warning had vanished under Englehart's galvanic treatments. She taught letters and numbers to the settlement's younger children, her days filled with routine, her nights quiet with family. Her parents thanked God for their daughter's recovery. They didn't know that Englehart thanked something else entirely. William was different. He arrived gaunt, lungs wheezing with each breath, his childhood spent in orphanages and half-forgotten attics. Within months under Englehart's care, the weakness left him. He began to build chairs, tables, cabinets, anything the settlement needed. His hands, once too unsteady to hold a saw, grew strong enough to carve a cradle. Englehart pared them deliberately, sorting herbs for the clinic's remedies, teaching side by side in Sunday school, sharing quiet work in the library where the heavy tick of the clock counted down to a wedding neither of them questioned. When the announcement came at a Tuesday lecture, it was framed as proof that science could match souls with more precision than God himself. Charts were displayed, graphs, phrenological diagrams showing the perfect temperamental alignment between Sarah and William. The applause that followed wasn't just for the couple, it was for the idea that the broken could be made whole. On the morning of September 15, 1858, the settlement woke before dawn. Women laid out pastries and bread, men arranged the hall. Even the children, many with twisted spines and withered limbs, wore fresh clothes and solemn expressions. Sarah's dress, white cotton threaded with pearls, caught the autumn light. William's suit, black and stiff, carried the faint smell of the cedar chest it had been stored in. The ceremony was simple. Vows of love, honor, and the sacred principles of hereditary science. The words felt odd in their mouths, but no one questioned them. When the newlyweds walked back down the aisle, smiling shyly at each other, the air seemed to hum with the promise of a new life. That night, as dancing filled the meeting hall, Englehart slipped away. In his office, he opened a leather-bound journal and wrote with the precision of a man recording not a marriage, but a test result. Primary phase of Experiment Series 3 successfully initiated. Subjects 3A and 3B joined in matrimony without suspicion of their true relationship. Both remain unaware they share the same parentage. Next phase, reproduction. The house they were given was modest. 2 stories with a view of Connoy Creek. William built the furniture himself, including the cradle. Sarah hung curtains sewn by her mother and placed her Bible on the bedside table. In their minds, they were building a home. In Englehart's, they were building a data set. 2 months later, Sarah was pregnant. It should have been joy, but from the beginning her body rebelled. Nausea that left her weak for days, headaches sharp enough to blind her, moments where she sat unmoving, staring at nothing, her eyes glassy and distant. June 21st, 1859, the summer solstice. Sarah labored for 36 hours while the entire settlement listened to her screams. When the child came, Charlotte Pennypacker, serving as midwife, froze. The head was misshapen, elongated, ridged. The eyes, mismatched, seemed to move independently. The fingers fused like a webbed pea. Addle. William staggered back in shock. Sarah sobbed. But Englehart stepped forward, calipers in hand, measuring the skull before the umbilical cord was even cut. His face was alight, not with concern, but with triumph. These, he told the parents, are merely variations. They will correct in time. They didn't. And Thomas Brennan would not be the only child born that year with abnormalities no one in the county had seen before. This was no longer a community. It was a breeding ground. By the winter of 1859, the air in Harmonia Springs had changed. Not the cold. Pennsylvania winters had always been cruel, but something in the way people spoke, the way eyes lingered a little too long on a swaddled infant, the way conversation stopped when footsteps approached. It began with the Zimmerman twins. Eva and Emma were born in January 1860, and from the moment they took their first breath, their bodies carried a design that no prayer could explain. Their spines curved in matching arcs, pressing their chests forward unnaturally. Their cries, a sharp, ceaseless wail, pierced through the walls of every home, night after night. No one slept. No one could escape the sound. In the spring, the Yoda's baby boy came into the world with a cleft palate so severe he couldn't draw milk from his mother's breast. Engelhardt stepped in with his solution. A thin leather tube inserted directly into the child's stomach. He said it was a temporary adaptation, but the Yodas watched their son grow pale and listless, his eyes sinking into his skull as though the will to live had never been there. Then came the Herzberger girl, her limbs bent in ways that made grown men look away. She couldn't straighten her elbows, and her knees buckled backwards like the joints of an animal not meant to walk upright. Engelhardt examined her in silence, then simply nodded and told the parents, "We will see what the bloodline yields next time." That word, yields, stuck in the minds of a few. It was the language of crops, not children, of breeding, not healing. But the families were trapped. Engelhardt's rules, once spoken as gentle suggestions, were now unbreakable law. No one left the settlement without his written consent. The gates, two heavy iron structures flanking the only road in or out, were manned day and night by two of his most loyal assistants, both large men who had been brought from outside the community and who rarely spoke to anyone. Mail, once sporadically allowed, was stopped altogether. Engelhardt claimed contamination of ideas could undo years of treatment. The settlement was a closed loop now, food grown in its fields, medicine made in its lab, births and deaths recorded only in his ledgers. Even religion had been rewritten. The Tuesday lectures grew longer, more fervent. His theories of hereditary purity became sermons. He spoke of the contamination of the national stock, of how the future of mankind depended on controlled lineage. He used words like refinement and purification as if they were virtues, and people listened, some because they believed, others because fear had already begun to replace doubt. But whispers persisted. Mothers began to notice something chilling. The children born after the first weddings all carried something in their bodies, something twisted, mismatched, or missing. Not one came into the world whole. Some said it was bad luck, others said it was God's curse. And then came the rumor no one dared to speak above a whisper, that the matches were not just bad, they were blood. A few families began to quietly test the rules. A father feigned illness to leave for town. He never returned. The story was that he'd taken his wages and abandoned his wife, but his belongings were still in their home. His boots were still by the door. One night, two young men, brothers by adoption, tried to slip past the gates under cover of fog. They didn't make it to the tree line. The next morning, the community gathered for a lecture on the dangers of disobedience as two fresh mounds of earth sat by the creek. Still, the births continued. The ledger filled with measurements, sketches, notes. It wasn't healing anymore. It was harvesting. By then, Sarah had begun to see things in her own son's eye. As that made her chest tighten with dread. Sometimes he would stare at her with that mismatched gaze, unblinking for minutes at a time. Sometimes he smiled at nothing. And somewhere deep down she began to wonder if this was not an illness to be cured, but a destiny someone had chosen for him before he was even conceived. It began with the sound of dripping water. Sarah had gone to Engelhardt's clinic late in the evening, carrying Thomas in her arms. He'd been feverish for 2 nights, his small body trembling with chills one moment and burning the next. Engelhardt was nowhere to be found, and the nurse on duty, a silent, sharp-faced woman brought to Harmonia Springs from outside the community, told Sarah to leave the child and return in the morning. Sarah refused. She would wait. She sat in the dim hallway, the gas lamps hissing overhead, listening to the faint drip, 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 from somewhere deeper in the building. Thomas slept against her chest, his breath ragged. The nurse disappeared into a back room. Sarah stood. She followed the sound through a door marked authorized personnel only. Beyond it, A narrow staircase led down into the earth. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying a damp, metallic scent that clung to her tongue. The basement was not like the rest of the clinic. It was stone, not brick, lit only by oil lamps bolted to the walls. Along one side, shelves stacked with glass jars, each filled with cloudy liquid and something suspended inside. She stepped closer. The shapes were unmistakable. Tiny limbs, faces, infants, some barely formed, others fully developed, their features distorted. Labels hung from their jars, written in Engelhardt's steady hand. Series 2C, Series 3B, Series 4A. Sarah's knees nearly gave way. The dripping sound came from the far corner, a leak from a copper pipe above a metal table. On the table lay another body, not in a jar, not preserved. This one had only just died. The child's head was wrapped in gauze, but where the fabric had slipped, she saw the swollen ridge of bone that ran from forehead to crown. Beside the table sat a journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. Pages of measurements, sketches of skulls, diagrams of spines, all numbered and cross-referenced. She flipped back to the most recent entry. Subject 3B offspring. Notable fusion of digits, heterochromatic ocular presentation, and cranial elongation consistent with hereditary concentration protocols. Recommend further pairing within siblings set to reinforce traits. The words hit her like ice. She read them again. Sibling set. She didn't understand at first. Then, slowly, she did. Her stomach turned so violently she had to lean against the table to keep from collapsing. William. Her husband, her brother. Thomas whimpered against her shoulder, pulling her back into the moment. She shoved the journal into the folds of her dress and hurried up the stairs, past the jars, past the locked door, into the gaslit hallway where the nurse reappeared, eyes narrowing. "You're not supposed to be down there," the nurse said flatly. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't breathe until she was outside, the cold night air cutting into her lungs. She walked quickly back to their house, locking the door behind her, clutching Thomas as if someone might try to take him from her right then. That night she didn't sleep. She read the journal under the flicker of a candle, each page a deeper descent into something she could barely comprehend. Experiments dating back 15 years, marriages arranged between cousins, half-siblings, and in one case, a father and daughter. Engelhardt's notes were clinical, detached, as if he were discussing livestock, not human lives. And then she found it. Her own name. Sarah G. Matched to William B. Annotation. Fraternal pairing from Series 2 subjects. Removed from shared household at 13 months to avoid recognition. Her hands went cold. Her skin felt wrong. The man she loved, the father of her child, was her blood. By dawn, the fear had sharpened into something else. Not panic. Not yet, but the first flicker of something Engelhardt had never intended for her to feel, the will to resist. She didn't know how, she didn't know if escape was even possible, but she knew one thing with perfect clarity: she could never let Thomas grow up here, and that, more than anything, would make her dangerous. The morning after she found the journal, Sarah moved like a woman in a dream. Every face in Harmonia Springs felt different now. The women she'd baked bread with, the men who'd worked beside William in the carpentry shop, all of them suddenly suspect. Who among them knew? Who was quietly complicit? Who would betray her without hesitation if they saw her step out of line? She said nothing to William, not yet. She studied him instead, the way his eyes softened when he looked at Thomas, the easy trust in his voice when he spoke of Engelhardt's treatments. If she told him the truth, their truth, what would it do? Would he believe her? Or would he run to Engelhardt, convinced the doctor needed to know she'd been overcome by delusions? She decided she couldn't risk it. Instead, she began to test the boundaries. Small tests, quiet ones. She offered to fetch herbs from the far edge of the settlement, near the gate. The guards didn't speak, didn't meet her gaze, but she saw the way their hands rested near the batons at their belts. One afternoon, she lingered near the carpentry shop longer than she needed to, listening to the gossip of two men loading timber. They spoke of a family, the Mertzes, who had gone missing the previous winter. The official word was that illness had forced them to leave, but one man swore he'd seen their house still stocked with food, their clothes hanging in the wardrobe, the fire still warm in the hearth the morning after they departed. That night, Sarah traced the edges of the journal hidden under the floorboard beneath her bed. Every word in it told her the same thing. Engelhart didn't just control Harmonia Springs, he owned it. The people, their bodies, their blood, they were his property, and escape wasn't just forbidden. It was unthinkable. But she was thinking about it, constantly. She began mapping her surroundings in her mind, the paths through the fields, the timing of the guards' shifts, the nights when the gas lamps near the gate burned low. She noticed the supply wagons that came in from Lancaster every other Thursday, bringing flour, cloth, and medical supplies. One wagon driver, a wiry man with a crooked jaw, seemed less loyal than the others. He avoided Engelhart's eyes. Still, she said nothing. One mistake, one whisper to the wrong person, and she'd vanish like the Mertzes. Engelhart, meanwhile, seemed almost more attentive to her. He inquired about her headaches, Thomas's feeding, her emotional constitution. He spoke in that calm, commanding tone that could make even suspicion feel like foolishness. But Sarah saw something new in his gaze when it lingered on Thomas. Not affection, not even pride. Calculation. It was at the Tuesday lecture that the true shape of her danger came into focus. Engelhart spoke longer than usual, moving from his theories of bloodline purification into a chilling new subject: continuity. He explained that the most promising subjects, his words, should not be left to breed just once, that a single pairing was merely the seed of a greater lineage. The second generation, he said, was where the concentration revealed its full power. And then, without warning, he looked directly at her. His eyes didn't linger long, but Sarah felt it. The message, unspoken but unmistakable. She wasn't done here. Neither was Thomas. That night, as William slept beside her, Sarah whispered into the dark, not to God, not to anyone who could save her, but to herself. "We're getting out." It was the bread that did it. On a raw February morning, Sarah went to the communal ovens before dawn. She liked the quiet there, the smell of yeast, the muffled thud of dough hitting wood, the hiss of steam when loaves came free from the oven's mouth. But that morning she found she wasn't alone. Mary Kessler was already there, pulling 2 dark, crusty rounds from the heat. Mary was not a friend, not exactly an enemy either, but Sarah had always known her to be sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, a woman who seemed to notice more than she let on. "Up early," Mary said, sliding a loaf into a basket. Sarah nodded, keeping her voice even. "Thomas is restless." Mary studied her for a moment, then, casually, almost carelessly, reached into her apron pocket and held out a folded scrap of paper. "If you value that boy," she said softly, "read this when you're alone. Burn it after." Sarah froze. "What is it?" But Mary was already moving toward the door. "The ovens will be hot again in an hour," she called over her shoulder, as if they'd been talking about baking the whole time. Sarah finished her loaves, heart hammering, the folded paper burning against her palm. Back home, with William gone to work and Thomas napping, she opened it. There were only 5 words, written in a firm, deliberate hand. "You are not the first." Her stomach tightened. She read it again and again, as if the meaning might change. That night she slipped out under the pretense of fetching water. Mary was waiting by the pump. They stood in the shadows, their breath steaming in the cold. "You've seen the basement," Mary said. Not a question. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Mary's face softened for the first time. "My sister had a daughter, born with no eyes. Engelhart called it a rare convergence. She died in the clinic. That was 5 years ago. I've been watching him ever since." She spoke. Quickly, like someone unburdening a truth that had been locked in her throat for too long. She told Sarah about the others, families who had tried to run, women who'd hidden pregnancies, men who'd refused Engelhart's pairings, all of them gone. "There are 2 ways out," Mary said. "Neither is easy. One is the supply wagon, The other is the old quarry path through the woods. The guards don't patrol it because it's dangerous, cliffs, loose rock. But if you make it to the creek, you can follow it to the road. Sarah felt dizzy. And you? Why haven't you left? Mary's jaw tightened. I can't. Not yet. My brother's still here. He's on the list. Sarah didn't ask what the list meant. She knew. Mary leaned closer. When you go, and you will go, you don't tell anyone. Not William. Not yet. You look at him and you see your husband. But in Englehart's eyes, he's a subject. And subjects don't leave. The cold seemed to seep deeper into Sarah's bones. She wanted to argue, to say William would never hurt them. But the words wouldn't come. Mary pressed something into her hand. A small, rusted key. Storage shed by the mill. Inside is a blanket, some dried meat, and a map. You'll know when it's time. Sarah swallowed hard. Why are you helping me? Mary looked at her like the answer should be obvious. Because once I thought I could live with what he was doing. I was wrong. Don't make my mistake. They parted without another word. Back in her house, Sarah tucked the key deep into the pocket of her dress, feeling its sharp edges bite against her fingers. For the first time since finding the journal, she didn't feel completely alone. And that, she knew, was something Englehart could never find out. It began with a bottle. Mary's whispered instructions had been clear. If Thomas gets sick again, don't take him to the clinic. Take care of it yourself. But taking care of it in Harmonia Springs meant finding what you needed without anyone knowing you were looking for it. The problem was that what Thomas needed, a fever tonic Mary had described in detail, could only be found in one place, Englehart's locked medicine cabinet. So Sarah waited. She knew the clinic's rhythms now, when the guards outside were thinnest, when the nurse's footsteps moved to the upper floor. She even knew the sound of Englehart's heavy gait versus the quicker tread of his assistant. On the third Thursday in February, the supply wagon arrived late. It was chaos at the loading dock, everyone scrambling to inventory the barrels and crates before nightfall. Sarah saw her moment. She walked in through the side door of the clinic like she belonged there, her shawl pulled low over her face, down the hallway past the examination rooms, to the door she remembered from her first visit. It was locked, of course, but the journal she'd taken, Englehart's journal, had contained more than breeding diagrams. There had been sketches of keys, and one of them, drawn with meticulous precision, looked almost exactly like the key Mary had given her. Her hands shook as she slid it into the lock. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a faint click. Inside, the air was cold, chemical. Shelves lined the walls, each bottle labeled in Englehart's neat hand. She found the tonic quickly. Salix bark extract, 5% solution, but hesitated. Because there, on the desk, lay another journal. This one newer, its cover still unscuffed. She told herself she didn't have time. She told herself she shouldn't risk it. But her fingers were already on the leather binding, already flipping to the first page. Subject 4A, Thomas. B, she felt her pulse in her throat. The entry detailed his birth, his growth, his unusually symmetrical cranial development. It noted his reaction to light, his precocious motor function, and ended with a chilling line. Recommend monitored separation from mother by age 3 to assess independent development. She nearly tore the page from the book. Instead, she shoved the journal into her shawl, grabbed the tonic and relocked the door. She was halfway down the hall when she heard it. Englehart's voice. Sarah, what brings you here this evening? He was standing at the far end of the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on her with the calm curiosity of a man observing a specimen. Her mind raced. She forced her face into something she hoped looked like worry. Thomas has a fever. I came to see the nurse, but she wasn't here. She lifted the bottle. I found what I needed. He stepped closer, slowly. You should have come to me. I always have time for Thomas. Sarah's grip tightened on the bottle. "You've been busy," she said. "I didn't want to trouble you." For a long moment he studied her, searching perhaps for cracks. Then he smiled. "You're a resourceful woman, Sarah. I like that." She gave him a tight nod and walked past him, feeling his gaze follow her all the way to the door. Only when she was outside, the cold night air hitting her lungs, did she realize her hands were still trembling. The tonic was for Thomas. The journal was for her. And if Engelhardt hadn't suspected her before, she was certain he did now. Sarah waited until the house was still. William's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, and Thomas, warm and damp from the fever, rested against her chest. Only then did she slip the new journal from its hiding place beneath the bed. By the light of a single oil lamp, she began to read. It was worse than she'd feared. The entries weren't just about Thomas. They were about her, about them. The early pages chronicled her pregnancy in cold, clinical terms. Subject 2F demonstrated excellent gestational tolerance, no complications, recommend repeat pairing within 14 months. Then came the section on Thomas. The detail was obsessive, notes on his sleeping patterns, vocalizations, weight fluctuations, even the color of his eyes in different light. But it was the last set of entries that made her hand go cold on the page. Projected transition plan. Subject 4A, age 3. Remove from maternal environment. Monitor adaptation to group care. Age 4 to 6. Educational conditioning. Language expansion. Removal of maternal references from speech. Age 7. Preliminary breeding assessment. Sarah's breath caught. She read it again, as if the meaning might somehow change. It didn't. The rest of the page was worse. A sketched diagram of a family tree with Thomas's name at the center, lines branching outward to symbols she recognized from the first journal. Engelhardt wasn't thinking of Thomas as a child. He was thinking of him as a foundation. And then, on the final page, one line, underlined twice. Subject 2F may resist separation, contingencies to be prepared, her own number, not her name, not mother, just Subject 2F. She closed the book carefully, though every muscle in her body screamed to hurl it into the fire. Mary's voice echoed in her mind, "You'll know when it's time." She thought she'd have months to plan, but the pages told her otherwise. She had less than 2 years before they took Thomas, maybe less if Engelhardt decided his contingencies were ready sooner. The danger wasn't creeping toward her anymore. It was running, and she would have to run faster. Sarah stayed awake until the first light of dawn, the journal open on her lap, mapping not just the quarry path and the supply wagons in her mind, but the faces of every person who might stand in her way. When Thomas stirred against her, she pressed her cheek to his hair. "We're not waiting," she whispered. "We're going before they even see us coming." The idea had been forming since the night Mary mentioned the supply wagons. If Sarah could speak to one of the drivers, truly speak, without the guards listening, there might be a chance, but that meant getting close enough to pass a message, and close enough meant risk. She chose a market day. On those days the guards were busy inspecting goods, and Engelhardt rarely left the clinic. The wagons lined up in the square, drivers trading news with townsfolk, swapping bread for tools, cloth for salted pork. Sarah kept Thomas on her hip, using him as both shield and pretense. She lingered near the third wagon, the one driven by the wiry man with the crooked jaw. She'd noticed before that he never quite met the guard's eyes. He was unloading sacks of grain when she stepped closer. "Long trip from Lancaster?" she asked, her voice casual. He glanced up, then back to his work. "Long enough?" His tone was curt, but she saw the flicker in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe suspicion. She pretended to adjust Thomas's blanket, slipping her hand into the folds of cloth where a scrap of paper waited. She'd spent hours perfecting the note, keeping it short enough to memorize if it was discovered. "Need help leaving. Woman and child. Will meet anywhere. Mark the quarry path if yes." When he stooped to lift another sack, she moved quickly, tucking the folded paper beneath the rough twine knot at the top of the load. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The driver paused, eyes flicking to her for the briefest moment. Then he hoisted the sack onto his shoulder without a word and carried it into the storage barn. Sarah forced herself to stay for several more minutes, buying a loaf of bread, asking after the price of apples, pretending she wasn't watching the barn door. When the driver re-emerged, his face gave nothing away. That night she barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters, felt like the moment someone would come for her. 2 days passed. Nothing. On the third evening, she told herself it had failed, that the driver had either ignored the note or turned it in. She was bringing in the washing when she saw it. A thin strip of cloth tied to the handle of her water bucket. At first she thought it was nothing, a rag someone had left behind, but when she untied it, her breath caught. It was marked with a smear of red clay, the kind that clung to boots near the quarry after rain. Her hands shook. It wasn't the explicit signal she'd asked for, but it was close enough, a message she could read loud and clear. Yes. That night she met Mary by the ovens. She told her what had happened, careful to keep her voice low. Mary's expression was unreadable. "It's a start," she said. "But don't trust it completely. He could be playing both sides. You need to test him before you commit." Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But contact, any contact, meant the world outside Harmonia Springs wasn't entirely closed to her. When she returned home, she found William at the table, mending one of Thomas's shirts. He smiled at her, that easy, open smile that used to make her feel safe. For the first time, she felt a pang of guilt sharp enough to hurt. She was making plans without him, keeping secrets he couldn't know, but Mary's warning rang in her ears. In Englehart's eyes, he's a subject. Sarah tucked the strip of cloth into her apron pocket, her fingers curling tight around it. She didn't know if the man with the crooked jaw would save her, betray her, or do nothing at all. But the first thread had been pulled, and threads, once pulled, had a way of unraveling the whole fabric. Sarah knew the first test couldn't look like an escape. It had to be something small, something plausible, something she could walk back from if the driver failed her, or worse, turned her in. She decided on the old mill. The building had been closed for years, its water wheel rotting, but the quarry path ran close behind it. If she could get there with Thomas and leave a small token, she'd see if the driver noticed. If he moved it, if he marked it somehow, she'd know he was watching. The trouble was leaving without William. On a grey morning thick with mist, she told him she was going to barter for flour. She wrapped Thomas in his thickest coat and took the long route to the market, doubling back toward the mill when she was sure no one was following. The air by the mill was damp and smelled of wet wood. Sarah scanned the area, no movement, no voices, then stepped off the path and knelt by a pile of old stones. She pulled the token from her apron, a wooden button from one of Thomas's shirts, worn smooth at the edges. She set it on the largest stone, the one closest to the path, then walked away without looking back. The waiting was the hardest part. All day she moved through her chores with her mind stuck in that damp clearing, wondering if the token was still there, if someone had already pocketed it. By dusk, she couldn't stand it any longer. She told William she'd forgotten something at the bakery and slipped out. The light was fading when she reached the mill again. Her stomach knotted. The stone pile looked different, disturbed. She approached slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. The button was gone. In its place lay a small scrap of burlap, frayed at the edges, dusted with red clay. Sarah's pulse quickened. The driver had seen it. He'd answered. But before relief could take hold, she heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel. She spun around to see one of Englehart's guards emerging from the shadows, his lantern swinging. "Evening, Mrs. B," he said, using the clipped tone they all seemed to adopt with her. His eyes flicked to the stone pile. "Out here for a stroll?" Sarah forced a laugh, clutching Thomas tighter. "I was showing him the old mill. My father worked in one like this when I was a girl." The guard's gaze lingered on the stones, then on her. "Don't wander too far. Dr. Englehart worries about folks getting hurt near the quarry." "I'll keep that in mind." She smiled just enough to look harmless, then walked past him toward the main road. Every step felt like a test. Don't hurry, don't look guilty, don't let your breath show how fast your heart is beating. Back home, she tucked the burlap into the same pocket as the red clay strip. 2 pieces now, 2 answers. Mary listened to her story that night, her expression tight. If the guards saw you there, they'll mention it to Engelhardt, she warned. You'll need a reason for being near the quarry if he asks. Sarah nodded. I'll think of something. But in truth, she already had. She'd say she was looking for a quiet place to think, or for herbs, or to show Thomas the wheel. Lies, all of them. But lies felt easier now than they had a month ago. She sat up late, watching the fire burn low, thinking about the driver. He'd answered twice now, but twice was not trust. Twice was not enough to put her son's life in his hands. Still, the quarry path no longer felt like a distant, impossible thing. It felt close, close enough to touch. And if Engelhardt suspected, she would have to move before the third answer came. Engelhardt never raised his voice. That was the worst part. When Sarah walked into the clinic that morning with Thomas, claiming he'd had a cough in the night, Engelhardt was waiting, standing just inside the door as if he'd been expecting her. "Good morning, Mrs. B," he said smoothly. "You've been keeping busy." The words sounded harmless, but his eyes pinned her in place. Sarah adjusted Thomas on her hip. "You mean the market?" "Yes, I mean the old mill." Her throat went dry. Engelhardt stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice even. "One of the guards mentioned seeing you there, with Thomas." He tilted his head. "A strange place for a mother to take her child, don't you think?" Sarah forced a smile she didn't feel. "I used to play in a place like that when I was a girl. I thought he'd like to see it." He let the sound linger as if tasting it. "And did he? Like to see it?" "Yes." "Good." Engelhardt nodded once but didn't move away. "You must forgive me, Sarah. I have a professional interest in where my subjects spend their time, especially those who matter most to my work." The word subjects made her grip Thomas tighter. "We're not part of your work. You're part of everything here." His voice was almost gentle now, but no less dangerous. "That's why I need to know you're safe. No wandering near the quarry, no loitering in abandoned buildings. There are hazards you can't see." Sarah swallowed. "I understand." "I hope you do." He gave her a small, deliberate smile. "Because if you were to get hurt, or if Thomas were to get hurt, the entire program could be compromised." He let the word hang in the air like the slow closing of a door. Then, just as suddenly, he turned toward his desk. "Now let's see about that cough." The rest of the visit passed in a blur, the cold metal of the stethoscope against Thomas's back, the scribbling of notes, the faint smell of antiseptic. Engelhardt spoke politely, but she felt his eyes on her the entire time, as though he were cataloguing not just Thomas's health, but her reactions. When it was over, he handed her a small bottle of syrup. "Give him a spoonful at night," he said, "and remember what I said about the quarry." Outside, the sunlight felt wrong. Too bright, too sharp. Sarah walked home slowly, the bottle heavy in her pocket. Mary was waiting in the kitchen. One look at Sarah's face and she set down the loaf of bread she'd been slicing. "He knows," Mary said. Sarah nodded. "He didn't accuse me, just reminded me what's at stake." Mary's jaw tightened. "Then it's time to move faster. You can't give him a reason to watch you more closely, but you can't stop preparing either." That night, Sarah took out the strip of cloth and the scrap of burlap, turning them over in her hands. They felt like promises, but also like warnings. If Engelhardt's eyes were already on her, the next step had to be more than a test. It had to be a move. And once she made it, there would be no turning back. Sarah spread the map across the table after William had gone to bed. It wasn't a real map, just a sheet of butcher paper she'd stolen from the bakery, with lines drawn in charcoal and pencil. The marks were crude, but they were enough. The quarry path ran northwest, curling around the base of the hill before joining the wagon road. She'd traced the bends and forks from memory, filling in details from snatches of conversation she'd overheard in the market. Beyond the road lay farmland, then forest, and then, if Mary's stories were true, a small river that could be followed to Lancaster. Every line felt heavier than ink. It was a choice, a risk, a point where things could go wrong. She planned in layers. Timing. The escape had to happen on a market day. The guards would be thinner in the residential streets, distracted by trade and inspections. The driver with the crooked jaw usually left in the late afternoon, and that would be her window. She'd aim to reach the quarry path just before he passed. If he truly meant to help, he'd slow the wagon enough for her to climb on unseen. Route. From her house to the mill, 10 minutes if she walked quickly carrying Thomas. From the mill to the path, another 5. She'd stay low, use the tree line for cover. If the driver failed to appear, she'd keep moving north on foot, following the wagon ruts until dark, then cutting into the woods. Risks. She listed them plainly in the margin. Thomas crying at the wrong moment. William waking early and realizing she was gone. A guard recognizing her near the mill. The driver turning her over to Engelhart. The last one she underlined twice. Sarah sat back, listening to the quiet of the house. From the bedroom she could hear William's slow breathing, the occasional soft cough from Thomas. That sound, the one that had brought her to Engelhart that morning, now felt like part of two. Danger itself. Mary had offered to help pack, but Sarah refused. If things went badly, she didn't want anyone else implicated. The bag would be small. Bread, dried apples, a tin cup, 2 changes of clothes for Thomas, and the blanket he wouldn't sleep without. Everything else was replaceable. She traced the quarry path on the paper one last time. In her mind, she walked it. The crunch of gravel, the smell of wet earth, the scrape of the wagon wheels. She imagined the driver glancing over his shoulder, giving the smallest nod, reaching out a hand. She also imagined the other version. The guards waiting just beyond the bend. Engelhart watching from the road with that calm, unreadable smile. Sarah folded the map and slid it into the flour bin. If someone searched the house, they'd find nothing but baking supplies. When she blew out the lamp, the darkness felt different, not heavier, sharper, focused. For weeks she had been reacting, reading, testing, waiting for signs. Now for the first time she had an answer for herself. Next market day. If she made it past the mill without being stopped, she wouldn't turn back. And if the driver didn't come, she would walk. The night before market day, the air in the house felt tight, as if the walls had shifted in just enough to notice. Sarah tried to keep her movements ordinary, folding laundry, setting the table, mending the frayed strap on her apron, but she kept catching William watching her, not the casual passing glances she was used to, but longer looks, as if he were memorizing her face. Thomas was asleep early, worn out from chasing a wooden hoop around the yard. The quiet should have been a relief, but it only made the weight between her and William more obvious. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just tired," she replied, keeping her eyes on the thread in her hands. "Not tired like that," he said. "Tired in here." He tapped his temple, then his chest. Sarah smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just the work, and the cough with Thomas last night. You know how I worry." William nodded slowly, but she could see the doubt in his expression. "You've been walking more," he said, "going to the market more, taking longer routes." She froze for a fraction of a second before forcing her shoulders to stay relaxed. "It's good for Thomas. He likes to see the town." He didn't argue, but the silence stretched, heavy enough to feel like a hand pressing on her back. Later, when they lay in bed, William shifted toward her. His arm came around her waist, the way it always had before, but this time she felt the gesture as both comfort and restraint. "I don't want anything to happen to you," he murmured. "It won't," she said, but her voice caught in a way she couldn't hide. He didn't press her, and she didn't explain. The words hung there in the dark, suspended between them. When his breathing slowed, she slipped out of bed, padding softly to the kitchen. She opened the flour bin and checked the folded map. Still there. Unto. Ched. Then she pulled the small bag from under the sink and ran her hand over its contents. Everything was ready. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Sarah sat at the table, staring at the door. In her mind, she played the morning over and over, rising before dawn, dressing Thomas quietly, slipping out while William slept. Every detail had to be perfect. But in the space between those thoughts was a harder truth. If William woke early, if he asked her where she was going, she didn't know what she would say. She returned to bed before the cold could sink too deep into her bones. William stirred, half awake, and whispered, "Sarah." "I'm here," she said, and in the stillness that followed, she wondered how long she could keep being here before the choice was made for her. The sky was still black when Sarah woke. She lay still for a moment, listening. William's slow breathing beside her, the faint creak of the rafters, the quiet sigh of wind under the eaves. Thomas was curled against her other side, warm and heavy. She eased herself free, careful not to shift the mattress, and dressed in the dark. Her thickest dress, the apron with the deep pockets, the scarf that covered her hair. The bag waited by the kitchen door. She checked it one last time. Bread, apples, cup, clothes, blanket, then wrapped Thomas in his coat. He whimpered once, but she pressed her cheek to his until he stilled. The floorboards groaned under her feet. She froze, breath held, but William didn't stir. The latch lifted with a soft click, and cold air rushed in. She stepped outside, closing the door without a sound. The street was empty, the lamps still burning in their glass cages. She moved quickly, keeping to the edges where the shadows pooled, every step taking her farther from the house, from the bed she'd just left, from William. By the time she reached the market square, the first signs of morning were thinning the darkness. Vendors were setting up stalls, the clatter of crates and murmured greetings masking her footsteps. She kept her head down, weaving between them, until she reached the narrow lane that curved toward the mill. Her heart pounded as the path dipped toward the water. The mill loomed out of the mist, its wheels still and dripping. She followed the tree line to the quarry path, scanning for movement. Nothing yet. She crouched by the stone pile, fingers brushing the rough burlap scrap she'd hidden there days ago. It was still in place, a marker, a signal, a promise. Then, faint but growing, came the sound she'd been waiting for, the slow, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels. Sarah stepped deeper into the trees, her breath sharp in her throat. The wagon appeared around the bend, the crooked-jawed driver hunched on the seat. His eyes flicked toward her hiding place, once, twice, then he slowed. It was enough. She shifted Thomas higher on her hip and darted to the wagon's rear. The driver didn't speak, didn't look back, but his hand dipped briefly toward the edge of the seat, a gesture so small it could have been nothing. She hooked the bag onto the frame, boosted Thomas up and climbed after him, pulling the blanket over both of them. The wagon rolled on. For a moment all she could hear was the crunch of gravel, the steady creak of the wheels. The quarry path narrowed, the air turning colder. She risked a glance toward the road ahead and saw the guard. He was standing just beyond the bend, lantern in hand, eyes sweeping the path. The wagon kept moving, but slower now. Sarah's fingers tightened around Thomas. She could feel the driver's hesitation in the change of rhythm, the subtle shift of the boards under her. If the guard stopped them, it was over. The guard's lantern beam cut through the mist, throwing long shadows across the wagon. Sarah pressed Thomas against her, pulling the blanket higher over both their heads. She could feel his tiny breath warm against her neck, the quick flutter of it betraying his unease. The wagon slowed almost to a crawl. She could hear the driver's boots scrape the wooden floorboard as he shifted forward, his voice calling out before they reached the guard. "Morning." His tone was flat, almost bored, the way men spoke when there was nothing worth noticing. The guard stepped closer, lantern swinging. "You're out early, Lars. Market run. Miller's got a load of sacks to haul." The driver flicked the reins lazily, but the wagon didn't move on. Sarah could feel the boards under her knees vibrating faintly with each hoofbeat. She stayed perfectly still, the smell of burlap and hay in her nostrils, every muscle straining to hear the guard's reply. Strange time for a market run, the guard said. His boots crunched closer, and the lantern light grew brighter through the weave of the blanket. The driver gave a shrug. You know the miller. Sleeps in the day, works at night, wants his flour on the early wagons. The guard paused. Sarah imagined his eyes narrowing, scanning the wagon. The light swept across the pile of sacks, the shadow of the wheels, and then, far too close, the lump she made under the blanket. A sudden cough tore from Thomas's throat, small but sharp in the quiet. Sarah's heart stuttered. She tightened the blanket around them, rocking slightly as though soothing him to sleep, but she knew the sound had carried. The guard's boots stopped beside the wagon. What's that? Cat, the driver said instantly. Barnes crawling with them this time of year. Caught one in the flour room. Miller told me to dump it near the quarry before it tears into the sacks. There was a long silence. The guard's lantern light lingered on the spot. Sarah could hear the faint rasp of his breath, the metallic rattle of his belt buckle shifting. You mind if I take a look? The guard said at last. Sarah's fingers dug into the burlap. If he lifted the blanket, there'd be no explaining away a woman and child hidden among the flour sacks. The driver chuckled, low and easy. Suit yourself, but the thing scratches, mean little brute. Boots on wood. The guard had set a foot on the wagon's back rail. Sarah didn't think. She slid her hand into the bag at her side, found the tin cup, and tipped it over, spilling its contents, a slow trickle of water, onto the boards near the guard's feet. The guard swore softly and jerked back. What the? See, the driver said quickly, seizing the moment. It's skittish, best not rattle it. He flicked the reins again, and the wagon jolted forward just enough to force the guard to step down. The boots hit gravel. The lantern's glow began to recede. All right, go on, the guard muttered. But tell the miller next time to keep his vermin at home. The wagon rolled on. Sarah didn't breathe until the bend in the road hid the guard from view. The driver didn't look back, didn't speak. But when they'd gone another 50 yards, his hand twitched once in the air, a small, quick motion, as if to say close call. She eased the blanket down just enough to see the road ahead. The quarry path was opening into the wagon road now, the mist thinning in the early light. For the first time that morning, she let herself believe they might actually make it. But the memory of that lantern beam, of how close it had come, stayed with her, sharp and bright as a warning. The road widened after the bend, the ruts deep from years of wagon wheels. The mist was breaking apart now, thin ribbons drifting across the fields. In the distance, Sarah could see where the land began to rise toward the forest. The driver kept his eyes on the path, jaw set, reins loose in his hands. He hadn't spoken since the guard. She didn't mind. Words felt dangerous right now, like they might shake the fragile luck that had carried them this far. Every bump in the road jolted Thomas in her lap. He stirred once, blinking at the pale light, but Sarah hushed him with a finger to her lips. He seemed to understand, curling back against her, the blanket pulled high. They passed a split in the road, one branch toward the main market road, the other toward the forest trail. The driver slowed. This is where I turn, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah's pulse quickened. The forest is that way. He gave a quick nod. A mile in, there's a stream. Follow it north and you'll reach the river. Keep to the trees. No one will see you. She glanced ahead. The market road was already stirring, a cart in the distance, a pair of riders on the ridge. If she stayed with the driver, she'd be heading straight into the day's business, where guards and traders alike might spot her. But the forest. The thought of being on foot with Thomas, miles from anywhere, felt like stepping off the edge of a roof. The driver seemed to read her hesitation. I can't take you farther without questions. That guard wasn't the only one on the road today. Sarah shifted the bag over her shoulder, tightening the strap. Her fingers brushed the worn cloth of Thomas's blanket. Every choice now felt like a gamble she couldn't undo. What about patrols in the forest? She asked. He shook his head. They stick to the roads, too much trouble in the trees, and if you keep moving, you'll be across the border by nightfall. She looked toward the forest again. The shadows between the trunks were deep, but they didn't feel like a trap. more like a curtain she could slip behind. The driver pulled the wagon to the side, just enough to shield her from the market road's view. "You should go now," he said. Sarah climbed down carefully, keeping Thomas close. Her boots sank into the damp earth at the edge of the trail. The smell of pine and wet soil wrapped around her, rich and clean after the dust of the quarry path. She turned back once. The driver gave her a single nod, then flicked the reins. The wagon rolled away without another word. For a moment she just stood there, the quiet pressing in. The forest ahead was still, except for the faint rush of water somewhere in the distance. "Come on," she whispered to Thomas, shifting him higher on her hip, "just a little farther." They followed the trail into the trees. The light dimmed under the canopy, but the ground was soft, muffling their steps. Sarah kept her ears sharp, the trickle of the stream growing louder, the rustle of leaves above, the occasional crack of a branch far off. When they reached the water, she knelt and let Thomas drink from the tin cup. The stream was narrow, but its current was steady, pulling north. She stepped into the shallows, boots sinking into cold mud. The forest closed around them, the world beyond the road already fading from sight. Sarah didn't look back again. The forest thickened as the day wore on, the trees crowding closer together until the path became nothing more than patches of light between roots. Sarah kept the stream to her left, letting its constant murmur guide her. The water grew wider and faster as they followed it, the ground sloping downward toward the river. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted to that dull gold that warned of dusk's approach. Thomas was heavy against her back now, half asleep in the sling she'd knotted from the blanket. Her legs ached, but she pushed on. The border river had to be close. Then she heard it. A deeper, stronger roar beneath the stream's chatter. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a strip of pale sky and the gleam of moving water. She stopped just short of the bank, scanning both directions. The river was broader than she'd expected, its far shore lined with willows. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the safer territory she'd risked everything to reach. But she wasn't alone. A man stood near the shallows downstream, his coat patched and his hat pulled low. He held a long pole, the kind used to steady small boats in the current. A skiff was pulled halfway onto the shore behind him. Sarah's first instinct was to turn back into the trees, but the man had already spotted her. He didn't call out, just lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Cautiously, she stepped closer, keeping her weight balanced to run if she had to. "You crossing?" he asked when she was within earshot. His voice was quiet, roughened by the wind. Sarah hesitated. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled faintly. "Depends who's answering." He nodded toward the skiff. "2 silver for the ride, or you can swim if you like the cold." She had the coins. Barely. But coins weren't the risk. If he was in league with the patrols, stepping into that boat might deliver her straight into their hands. "How do I know you won't take me back?" she asked. "You don't," he said simply. "But I've taken more across than back. That's worth something." Thomas stirred against her back, murmuring in his sleep. The sound seemed to change the man's posture. His gaze softened just enough. "It's a hard walk along the bank," he added. "You'll hit the bridge before you hit safety, and they're watching the bridge." She looked at the current. The water was fast, dark in places where the depth pulled hard. Swimming with Thomas would be madness. The man stepped into the skiff, holding it steady with the pole. "Last trip before dark," he said. "You coming or not?" Sarah's breath caught. Every nerve told her that one wrong choice here could undo everything. But the far shore was right there, close enough that she could almost smell the damp earth under the willows. Slowly she loosened the sling, shifting Thomas into her arms. She stepped into the skiff, the wood rocking under her boots. The man said nothing as he pushed away from the bank. The current caught them at once, spinning the skiff slightly before he righted it with a firm push of the pole. Halfway across, the wind rose, carrying faint voices from upstream, shouts, and the distant metallic clink of gear. The man's jaw tightened. "Hold him close," he muttered. Sarah did, her eyes locked on the far shore, praying the current carried them faster than the sound. The shouts grew sharper, no longer carried lazily on the wind. They were coming fast now, slicing through the roar of the river. Sarah turned her head just enough to see them. 2 men in dark coats on the upstream bank, one pointing, the other already scrambling into a narrow patrol skiff. "They've seen us," she whispered. The ferryman didn't answer. His whole frame bent into the pole, driving it deep into the riverbed and pushing hard. The skiff surged forward, the current latching onto them like a living thing, pulling them downstream and across in the same breath. But the patrol's boat was moving too, light, low, built for speed. It skimmed over the water, the man in the bow bracing with a hooked pole, the other rowing with quick, brutal strokes. Sarah shifted Thomas so his face was buried against her chest. He squirmed once, sensing the tension, then went still under her hand. The far bank was close enough now that she could see the roots of the willows dipping into the water, their branches trailing like long fingers. But close wasn't close enough. "Can we make it?" she asked. "Maybe," the ferryman said, and the way he said it made the cold bite harder in her chest. The patrol skiff angled across the current, cutting the distance. The man in the bow leaned forward, the hook in his hands catching a flash of light. Sarah's mind raced. If they caught the skiff's edge, they could spin them, stall them, drag them back. She looked around. There was nothing in the boat. No spare pole, no oar she could use as a weapon, only the bag at her feet. She crouched, fumbling inside until her fingers closed around the heavy loaf of bread she'd packed at dawn. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the patrol's boat drew alongside, the man with the hook shifted his weight, reaching. Sarah waited until his arm was extended over the water, the hook just shy of their gunwale, and then hurled the loaf with every ounce of her strength. It hit him square in the face with a dull thud. He jerked back with a curse, losing his balance. The hook splashed into the river, the sudden weight yanking him sideways. For a heartbeat he clung to the edge of their own boat, then slipped into the current with a shout. The other man grabbed for him, their skiff rocking wildly. The ferryman didn't waste the moment. He drove the pole deep again, shoving their own skiff forward in a lurch that nearly pitched Sarah to her knees. The willow branches were close now, whipping at her face. She reached out, catching one in her free hand, and the ferryman angled the boat sharply toward shore. The skiff scraped bottom, and Sarah jumped into the shallows, cold water flooding her boots. She splashed to the bank, scrambling up onto the damp earth with Thomas clutched tight. The ferryman hauled the skiff in just long enough for her to reach solid ground, then shoved back into the current. "Go!" he called over his shoulder. "Don't look back!" She didn't. The forest swallowed her within a dozen steps, the roar of the river fading behind her. The air under the willows was thick and still, the smell of wet leaves sharp in her lungs. She kept moving, heart hammering, every step carrying her deeper into the safety she had barely dared to imagine an hour ago. For the first time in days, there were no walls, no gates, no watching eyes, only trees and the long, narrow path ahead. Sarah didn't stop moving until her lungs burned and her legs felt hollow. The ground underfoot rose slightly, the willow swamp giving way to firs and high ground carpeted in needles. She finally ducked behind a fallen trunk, easing Thomas down into the soft litter of moss and pine. For the first time since the quarry road, the only sounds were the wind and the faint creak of the trees. No boots on gravel, no shouts, no splash of oars. Thomas blinked up at her, still half drowsy. His hair was damp from the river spray, a single curl plastered to his forehead. She brushed it back, her fingers trembling before she realized it. "You're safe," she whispered, the words more for herself than for him. "We made it." He didn't answer, but his little hand found her sleeve, curling there as if to anchor them both. Sarah leaned her back against the log, drawing in slow, deliberate breaths. She let her eyes travel over the forest, the way the sunlight broke into shards through the high branches, the drift of tiny seeds in the air, the deep, resinous smell that filled her lungs. It was the smell of somewhere untouched, somewhere the patrols wouldn't bother to follow. She remembered the ferryman's warning, keep moving, keep to the trees. But for the first time in days, she allowed herself to pause. She opened the bag, taking stock. The bread was gone, but she still had half a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, a tin cup, and a handful of dried apples, enough for the night if she rationed it. Thomas sat up, his gaze drawn to a shaft of sunlight that caught a swirl of dust and pollen. "Mama," he said softly, pointing. She followed his gesture. The golden flecks drifted lazily, turning in the light. It was nothing, and yet, after the river's danger, it felt like a blessing, a reminder that beauty could still exist on the far side of fear. They ate in silence, the forest watching over them. Every so often she tilted her head, listening for anything that didn't belong, but all she heard was the slow rhythm of wind in the branches and the occasional clatter of a squirrel leaping from tree to tree. Her thoughts drifted to the ferryman. She didn't know if he'd make it back to his side without trouble, or if the patrol would catch him. He hadn't asked her name. Maybe that was his way, ferrying strangers across, each forgetting the other the moment they were gone. When they'd finished eating, Sarah folded the blanket back around Thomas, more for comfort than warmth. The air was cooling now, the shadows stretching long. She stood, adjusting the strap of the bag. The border was behind her, but the journey wasn't over. There were still miles to go before she reached the village she'd been told about, the one where people like her could start again without questions. She looked once more through the trees toward where the river must be, hidden now by the forest's rise. The danger was still real in her memory, the hook flashing in the sun, the boat spinning in the current, the moment she'd thought it was over. But it wasn't over. She'd crossed. She was here. "Come on," she said, reaching for Thomas's hand. His small fingers wrapped around hers without hesitation. Together they stepped back onto the faint deer trail that wound deeper into the trees, the smell of pine guiding them forward. The forest was theirs now, and the road ahead, for the first time, felt like it might belong to them too. The forest thinned gradually, the trees giving way to open meadow dotted with wildflowers that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. Sarah slowed her pace, scanning the horizon. Beyond the meadow, nestled in a shallow valley, lay a cluster of stone cottages. Smoke curled lazily from their chimneys, the scent of wood fire drifting faintly across the grass. Thomas's hand tightened in hers. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice small but edged with hope. "I think so," she murmured. She'd heard of this place in whispers, a village where the border's reach faltered, where no one asked how you'd come or why. It had sounded too good to be true. Now, seeing it, she wasn't sure whether to believe in its safety or brace for another fight. They crossed the meadow slowly, the ground warm underfoot from the day's sun. As they neared the first cottage, a woman emerged from a garden, a basket of onions hooked over her arm. Her hair was streaked with grey, her face lined but kind. "You're far from the river," the woman said, her voice even, not suspicious, but not overly warm either. Sarah hesitated. "We're looking for a place to rest." The woman studied her for a long moment, her gaze flicking to Thomas, then to the damp hem of Sarah's skirt. "Come," she said finally, tilting her head toward the village centre. "You'll want to speak with Elric." Sarah followed, every step through the tidy lanes a small test of her nerves. People paused their work to glance up. A man mending a fence, two boys chasing a hoop, an old man leaning on a cane. None called out, but none turned away either. They reached a larger building at the village's heart, its door standing open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of stew. A man sat behind a worn oak table, ledger open before him. His hair was cropped short, his clothes plain but clean. The woman set down her basket, found her at the Diggy, she told him, said she's looking for a place to rest. Elric's eyes, sharp and steady, rested on Sarah. "You've crossed." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We don't mean trouble, just a place." He leaned back in his chair, considering. "We don't ask questions about the road behind you," he said. "But we do expect something in return for staying. Everyone works, in the fields, the kitchens, or the watch." Sarah nodded quickly. "I can work." Thomas peeked from behind her, and Elric's expression softened slightly. "And the boy?" "He's mine," she said. "He'll be no trouble." Elric closed the ledger. "Then you'll start tomorrow. Tonight, Maren here will see you fed." The woman, Marin nodded and gestured for Sarah to follow. They crossed to a smaller house near the edge of the village where a single room held a bed, a hearth, and a table. It wasn't much, but the sight of a roof and solid walls nearly undid Sarah. Marin set a loaf of bread and a jug of water on the table. Eat, rest, the fields will seem shorter in the morning. When she left, the room was quiet except for the faint crackle of the hearth. Sarah sank onto the bed, pulling Thomas close. He curled against her side, his breathing slow and even. For a long time she just sat there, letting the stillness settle over her. Her mind drifted to the road behind, the quarry dust, the guard at the wagon, the ferryman's skiff. She saw the willow branches again, the golden flecks in the forest air, the moment she realized they had truly crossed. Here, no one had asked for her name or her story. That, she realized, was the gift. Outside, the last light faded over the meadow, the smoke from the chimneys blending into the dusk. Sarah lay back, the rough blanket warm over both of them, for the first time in what felt like years, her eyes closed without fear of what the next morning might bring. They had made it. And here, finally, they could begin again.